let's understand this bind, call, and apply. Let's imagine we are having a user object, and instead of this user object, we're going to greet the user or creating this function. Instead of this greet function, we're going to console.log this, for example. Now, right below, let's say we want to call user.greet and we want to execute the function. We're going to run the code, and inside of the terminal, we see that we're getting back this line of code. So what is really happening right here is that this, in this case, points to the object that has called this function. So this points to this user. What would happen if we would go ahead and copy this function to another variable though? So let's say our copy is going to be equal to user.greet, and now we are going to call our copy as a function. And now if we execute that code, I really recommend you to take a look at this inside of the browser. So if we open our console right here, you can see that we're getting undefined. In contrast, let's call user.greet right here. So we see it everything side by side. So one time we get the pointer to our object, and the other time we get undefined. So why do we get undefined right here? By saying that copy is equal to user.greet, we are just saying that our copy is equal to this function. So this will call this function. But at this point, the reference to the user will be lost. So it will not copy the reference to the user. It will just copy the function call. So this would be pretty much similar to creating a function that has the name greet, and then you essentially say that copy is equal to this function. The context in which this function exists in the context of the user gets lost. Now if I wanted to say that this copy should also reference the user or consider the user, so if I wanted to bind this essentially, I can for example say after user.greet that I want to bind this to the user. So I want to bind this copy to the user. I'm going to call copy right here. So let's just execute the code. Let's reload the page. And as you can see, we are getting greet and greet. So for both of those executes, we get the pointer to our object. So now let's get rid of that line right here. And let's also get rid of that line right here. So again, we're just saying instead of our copy, we will copy the user.greet function. So right now we are getting undefined again. So now let's imagine this function right here would have an argument of name, for example. And let's say we're just going to console.log this, and we're also going to console.log our name. So now we need to use a name right here, for example. And now if we're going to log that one, you can see that we're still getting undefined and we're getting the name Pascal. So isn't there a way to immediately just call the copy once, bind whatever object we want to use to this, and then immediately execute that? And there is something like that. So you can say copy.call, for example. So you can use the call function. Right here, you have to define what do you want to bind this to. And in our case, let's say we want to bind to our user. So now we are binding this to the user. We can execute that one. And as you can see, we're getting, again, the pointer to our user for this. And we're getting the name right here. There's also another method to do the exact same thing. And that is copy.apply. Again, what do we want to bind this to? In our case, we want to bind this to our user. And right here, the difference is that you have to apply the arguments by using an array. So we can say Jonas, for example. Going to save that one, going to refresh our index file. And now we have Pascal and Jonas. And again, this is bound to our user object. So if you want to bind something permanently, you can also do it like this by saying .bind user. So now this copy will always be bound to this object right here. If you only want to bind the user one single time when calling the function, you could just use call or apply. So let me show the difference. Let's remove that one again. And if I'm going to call copy afterwards, so after the call and the apply method right here, we will get undefined in the console. Let me refresh. Oops, and we need to remove that. So now let me refresh. And as you can see, we're getting the pointer to our object for those two calls right here. And even if I'm going to say this one has a name, for example, let me refresh, we are still getting undefined and the name. So this here does not seem to point to our object anymore. So bind will always bind, call and apply will only bind for one single call.